In the final summer of World War II, as the Pacific burned and the world teetered between exhaustion and annihilation, a single weapon was prepared that would forever redefine humanity's understanding of power. On the morning of August 6, 1945, in the skies above a city few Americans could have pointed to on a map, that weapon came to life. Its name was Little Boy. Its target, Hiroshima. In 43 seconds, the world would change forever. But the story of that day, of how America arrived at such a fateful moment, began long before the bomb bay doors opened over Japan. It began in the desperate, grinding years of war, and in the hearts of men who believed they were about to save civilization itself. By 1945, World War II had consumed the world for nearly 6 years. Entire continents lay in ruins. In Europe, Adolf Hitler was dead, his empire burned to ashes. But in the Pacific, Japan refused to surrender. The Japanese empire had been cornered, its navy shattered, its cities burning nightly under waves of American bombers. Yet its leaders, bound by a code of honor older than the nation itself, refused to yield. To surrender was unthinkable, a fate worse than death. The Allies knew an invasion of Japan would be catastrophic. The projected casualties were staggering. Estimates ranged from 500,000 to 1 million Allied soldiers, and perhaps 10 times as many Japanese civilians. For President Harry S. Truman, a man who had inherited the most terrible weapon ever built, the question was no longer if it should be used, but when and where. Far across the Pacific, an isolated island had been transformed into a forward base for one final act. Its name was Tinian. From this small patch of coral and jungle, American engineers and airmen worked under the tightest secrecy imaginable, assembling a weapon that even they scarcely understood. It was the product of the Manhattan Project, the largest and most secret scientific endeavor in history. For 3 years, tens of thousands of Americans had labored in total silence. Towns were built and entire communities fenced off. Not even the workers knew what they were building. At the heart of it all, uranium, isolation, and the dream, or nightmare, of harnessing the atom. July 16, 1945. In the desert of New Mexico, the night turned to day. A blinding flash lit the sands of Alamogordo as the first atomic bomb, codenamed Trinity, erupted in a fireball that reached hotter than the sun. Scientists who witnessed it stood in stunned silence. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the man who had directed the bomb's creation, later recalled a line from scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The test proved that the unimaginable was now possible. Truman received the message while attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany. Surrounded by Stalin and Churchill, he now held a weapon beyond comprehension, a secret that could end the war, and perhaps all wars. Yet the president hesitated. The atomic bomb was not merely another instrument of destruction, it was a moral Rubicon. Should he drop it on a city, knowing tens of thousands of civilians would die in an instant? Or should he send hundreds of thousands of Americans into a bloody invasion of Japan's home islands, a fight that could drag on for months? For Truman, the answer came in the grim arithmetic of war. Every day the conflict continued, thousands more died across the Pacific, soldiers, prisoners, and civilians alike. If one bomb could end it, perhaps even such horror was justified. And so, the order was given. On the island of Tinian, the men of the 509th Composite Group received their final mission orders. Their commanding officer, Colonel Paul Tibbets, a cool-headed and methodical pilot from Illinois, had been chosen to lead the operation. The aircraft, a silver B-29 Superfortress he personally named after his mother, Enola Gay. Around them, engineers worked around the clock assembling the bomb's components. They handled its uranium core with tools and care beyond comprehension, knowing that one mistake could obliterate the entire airfield. The weapon was a marvel of both science and destruction, 9,000 pounds of steel, uranium, and design never before tested in combat. It would be the first atomic bomb ever used against a human target. On the evening of August 5, 1945, Tibbets gathered his crew for a final briefing. No one spoke loudly. The air was heavy with anticipation and unease. Each man was handed a small cyanide capsule, a chilling precaution in case they were shot down and captured. They knew what they were carrying was no ordinary bomb. At 2:45 a.m., Enola Gay lifted off the runway at Tinian. Her engines roared into the night, carrying the most powerful weapon ever built into history's longest shadow. The flight took 6 hours. Inside the B-29, the crew sat in tense silence as the Pacific rolled beneath them, black, endless, indifferent. At 7:09 a.m., radar contact was made with the Japanese coastline. The city of Hiroshima appeared below, a city of soldiers, factories, schools, and families. It was a bright, clear morning. Children were walking to class. Workers were beginning their day. At 8:15 a.m., bombardier Thomas Farabee locked his sights on the T-shaped AIOI bridge, the precise aiming point. Seconds later, he released the bomb. Little boy fell for 43 seconds. At exactly 1,900 feet above the city, it detonated. The flash was seen for miles. In an instant, Hiroshima became a storm of light. A fireball expanded faster than sound, vaporizing everything within a mile. Temperatures reached over 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Concrete buildings disintegrated. Human shadows were burned into walls. The shockwave flattened the city. Glass and metal became shrapnel, cutting down anyone who still stood. Those within half a mile were simply gone, erased from existence. For others, the agony came in fire and silence. Eyewitnesses spoke of people whose skin hung in tatters, of streets filled with bodies and silence where a city once stood. Within minutes, Hiroshima ceased to exist. When Enola Gay banked away, the crew watched the mushroom cloud rise, a column of fire reaching 40,000 feet into the air. Tibbets later said it looked like boiling dust and fire, a living thing. No one spoke for a long time. At 8:16 a.m., the world had entered the atomic age. Back in Washington, reports began to filter in, though even the best intelligence could not grasp the scale of destruction. 90,000, 100,000, the numbers blurred together. Entire families had vanished. Hospitals overflowed with the burned and the blind. Yet even then, Japan did not surrender. In the imperial palace, the government remained divided. Some still believed the Americans could be fought to the last man. Others urged peace. The emperor himself hesitated, torn between duty, pride, and the unbearable cost. As the days passed and no word of surrender came, President Truman made another decision, one that would seal Japan's fate forever. 3 days after Hiroshima, another B-29 lifted off from Tinian, this one named Boxcar. Its target, Nagasaki. The bomb, Fat Man, a plutonium device even more powerful than the first. On August 9, 1945, at 11:02 a.m., it exploded above the Urakami Valley. 40,000 people died instantly. By the end of the year, the death toll would rise to 70,000. The message was unmistakable: Japan could no longer stand against such force. For the first time, the emperor spoke directly to his people, his voice broadcast across a shattered nation. He urged them to endure the unendurable. On August 15, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. In that single week of August 1945, humanity had crossed into a new era, one where the power to end civilizations could fit inside the belly of an airplane. For America, victory had come, but at a cost that still echoes through time. The atomic bomb ended the deadliest war in human history, yet it opened a door to fears that have never truly closed. For those who lived through it, both American and Japanese, the memories remain unbearable. Many still debate whether the bomb saved lives or destroyed something far greater, humanity's innocence. But one truth endures, that in the summer of 1945, mankind glimpsed its own extinction and could never look away again. On that bright August morning, when 90,000 souls vanished beneath a single flash of light, the world changed forever. And in that moment, whether through triumph or tragedy, humanity learned that even victory can burn brighter and darker than the sun itself. In the smoldering silence after Japan's surrender, the world stood still. Across the Pacific, from the beaches of Iwo Jima to the ruins of Manila, the guns of war had finally gone quiet. But peace did not bring celebration to everyone. In cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was only ash, ruin, and the sound of a generation trying to understand what had just happened. For the first time in human history, the victors looked upon victory itself with unease. America had won, yes, but in doing so, it had stepped into a moral wilderness no one had ever walked before. In Tokyo Bay, on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri, the Japanese delegation arrived in solemn procession on September 2, 1945. They wore black coats and bowed low as they approached General Douglas MacArthur, who stood straight-backed and silent. It was not triumph in his eyes, but gravity. Around him, rows of sailors, soldiers, and officers stood in absolute stillness. When Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed the instrument of surrender, his hand trembled slightly. Behind him, General Yoshijiro Umezu followed suit. At 9:04 a.m., MacArthur stepped forward and declared, "These proceedings are closed." Just like that, the Second World War, the deadliest conflict in all of human history, was over. Yet as the ink dried on that page, something deeper began to take shape. For the United States, the atomic bomb was more than a weapon, it was a symbol. In that moment, America was not only the world's most powerful nation, it was the first to hold dominion over the very building blocks of the universe. And that power, both awe-inspiring and terrifying, cast a long shadow over everything that followed. In the days after Hiroshima, American newspapers carried headlines that bordered on the surreal. New weapon ends war, read one. Atomic bomb a miracle of science, read another. To a war-weary public, the bomb seemed like divine intervention, a way to stop the bloodshed without invading Japan's home islands. But the details that trickled in over time painted a darker picture. Survivors described bodies that crumbled at the touch, rivers choked with the dead, children burned beyond recognition. What many Americans saw as a triumph of science, others began to recognize as a glimpse of apocalypse. For President Truman, the burden of that choice never left him. In public, he defended the decision without apology, saying, "We used it in order to shorten the agony of war." Privately, however, he confided to his aides that the weapon haunted him. He refused to allow the atomic bomb to be used again without his express order, and when later asked if he ever lost sleep over the bomb, he replied, "Hell yes. And I still do." Meanwhile, in Japan, the survivors, known as the hibakusha, began to emerge from the ruins. Many were unrecognizable, burned and scarred, wandering through flattened streets that once held homes, schools, and shrines. A Hiroshima doctor described seeing ghosts with skin hanging from their arms, silent, walking as if already dead. In Nagasaki, entire valleys had turned to cinders. Thousands died days or weeks later from a strange new sickness that no one yet understood, radiation poisoning. Hair fell out in clumps, gums bled, fevers spiked. It was suffering beyond imagination, and it continued long after the bombs stopped falling. American occupation forces entered Japan expecting hostility. Instead, they found resignation. The Japanese people, broken and starving, did not rise in rebellion, they rebuilt. Under General MacArthur's supervision, Japan began one of the most extraordinary transformations in history. Within months, censorship was lifted, the military was disbanded, and a new constitution was drafted, one that renounced war forever. Women gained the right to vote, and democracy took root in the very soil once drenched in imperial blood. But beneath that rebuilding, a quiet grief lingered. The ruins of Hiroshima became not only a reminder of defeat but a warning to the world. As reconstruction began, scientists from the Manhattan Project returned home to uneasy applause. Some were hailed as heroes, others as destroyers. Many had believed the bomb would be used merely as a demonstration, perhaps on an uninhabited island, to force Japan's surrender. But war had its own logic, and now they lived with its outcome. Oppenheimer himself faced the press only once. When asked if he felt pride, he paused and said, "I have blood on my hands." He knew the world could never return to what it was before. In the months after VJ Day, the United States surveyed the destruction with an eye toward understanding what it had unleashed. Military photographers documented every inch of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Scientists collected samples of soil, metal, and human tissue to study radiation effects. But even they could not fully comprehend what they were witnessing. A single bomb had done what thousands of planes could not. It had erased cities. It had rewritten war for itself. Across the ocean, America's wartime ally, the Soviet Union, watched in silence. To Joseph Stalin, the bomb was not a moral question but a strategic one. If America had it, the USSR must have it too. Within weeks of the Japanese surrender, Stalin ordered his scientists to begin their own atomic program. The arms race had begun before the ashes of Hiroshima were even cold. By 1949, the Soviets had tested their own atomic bomb, ending America's monopoly on nuclear power. Within years, both nations built weapons far beyond the scale of those dropped in 1945. The hydrogen bomb, capable of vaporizing entire regions, became reality. What had once ended a war now threatened to end civilization itself. The Cold War, an age of fear, rivalry, and brinkmanship, was born in the glow of those first atomic flashes. And yet, amid all of this, there were those who refused to let the memory of Hiroshima fade into abstraction. Survivors spoke publicly despite shame and stigma. Artists painted scenes of burned landscapes and twisted shadows. American soldiers, too, wrestled with what they had witnessed. Some, decades later, confessed they had come to believe they'd opened something that could never be closed again. The world had entered an age where one mistake, one miscalculation, could turn night into day once more. The bomb had given humanity the means to destroy itself. But it had also given birth to a movement, a global reckoning with conscience. For the first time, scientists, clergy, and ordinary citizens began to question whether progress itself could go too far. The atom had promised infinite energy and scientific advancement, but it also revealed that mankind's greatest genius could be indistinguishable from its greatest madness. In the heart of Hiroshima, the ruins stood for years as silent witnesses. Where the bustling Shima hospital once stood, only a cracked foundation remained. The skeletal frame of the Genbaku Dome, once an industrial exhibition hall, became a ghostly monument, its dome twisted and scorched but still standing amid a sea of nothingness. Locals called it the Atomic Dome. In time, it would become a symbol of both horror and hope, preserved as a warning that no one should ever suffer such a fate again. In 1946, the American government began to realize that the bomb's shadow stretched far beyond Japan. Radiation sickness appeared not only in survivors but in soldiers and scientists who had handled materials without understanding their danger. Stories trickled out of Los Alamos and Oak Ridge, of men who worked in secrecy and died in silence, their illnesses unexplained. What had been hailed as a miracle of science was now proving to be a poison with no cure. Still, the machinery of nuclear progress could not be stopped. The Cold War demanded it. Back in Washington, President Truman faced a new dilemma. With the world divided between capitalism and communism, the bomb became the ultimate deterrent, a weapon meant not to be used but to be feared. American school children practiced duck and cover drills, hiding beneath wooden desks as if they could protect them from a nuclear blast. The government built fallout shelters and distributed pamphlets explaining how to survive an attack that no one could truly survive. In the deserts of Nevada, the sky lit up again and again as test after test turned sand into glass. The age of atomic anxiety had begun. But amid all this, something remarkable happened. The same generation that had unleashed the bomb began to question its own creation. Veterans who had fought on Okinawa and Iwo Jima, men who had seen the cost of invasion firsthand, wrote letters saying they still couldn't decide whether the bomb was a necessary evil or a step too far. Some believed it had saved millions of lives. Others believed it had damned the human spirit. The debate would never end. It would simply evolve, decade by decade, as new generations inherited the legacy of August 6, 1945. For the Japanese survivors, life was not simply about rebuilding, it was about remembering. They gathered in small groups to share stories, to pass on memories that could not be photographed or written down. They spoke of the unbearable silence after the explosion, the smell of burning hair, the sound of glass crunching beneath bare feet. These were memories that clung to them long after the wounds healed. The hibakusha were often shunned, treated as outcasts, as if radiation sickness were contagious. Yet their endurance, their refusal to vanish, became its own quiet act of defiance. Children born in the aftermath grew up among ruins turned into schools and parks. Each year on August 6, they gathered at the Peace Memorial Park in Hiroshima, releasing paper lanterns down the river, tiny floating lights for each life lost in that single morning of fire. The air filled with prayer and reflection. Even American visitors, soldiers, and civilians alike often found themselves overwhelmed by the stillness of that place. The names on the cenotaph grew longer with each passing year, for even decades later, radiation continued to claim lives. And while Japan grieved, America's conscience evolved. The same scientists who had once raced to build the bomb now campaigned to limit its spread. Oppenheimer himself became one of the loudest voices against nuclear proliferation, calling for international control of atomic weapons. He faced condemnation and was stripped of his security clearance during the Red Scare, branded as untrustworthy. It was one of the bitter ironies of history that the man who gave birth to the atomic age was cast aside for warning of its dangers. Meanwhile, the bomb became both myth and message. In films, newsreels, and classroom lectures, it was portrayed as both savior and monster. Some saw divine justice, others saw the devil's work. Politicians invoked it as a symbol of deterrence. Churches used it as proof that mankind had overreached its bounds. Philosophers compared Hiroshima to Pandora's box, the moment humanity learned it could not unknow what it had created. By the 1950s, Japan had rebuilt much of what had been destroyed. Cities once reduced to rubble now buzzed with factories, railways, and neon lights. American aid poured in, helping to transform the defeated nation into a democracy and, eventually, an economic powerhouse. But underneath that prosperity lay a quiet truth: Japan had become the first and only nation to know the full horror of atomic warfare. Its people carried that knowledge not as pride, but as a burden for all humanity. In 1955, Hiroshima hosted its first World Conference against atomic and hydrogen bombs. Survivors spoke publicly for the first time before a global audience, describing the flash, the heat, and the years of suffering that followed. Their message was not revenge, it was warning. One elderly survivor, his voice trembling, said simply, "We must be the last." That phrase became a moral creed for generations to come. Across the ocean, the Cold War deepened. In 1962, the world came closer than ever to nuclear annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days, Americans watched television and prayed as President John F. Kennedy faced off against Nikita Khrushchev. Both men understood what Hiroshima had made possible. One misstep, one wrong word, could mean the end of everything. In those tense weeks, the lesson of August 1945 returned like a ghost, reminding the world of what a single bomb could do. By the 1970s, a new generation had grown up in the shadow of the mushroom cloud. They had not lived through Hiroshima, but they carried its fear in their bones. Movies, protests, and marches echoed a single message: never again. The atomic bomb had become not only a weapon but a mirror, reflecting humanity's genius and its madness in equal measure. In Hiroshima itself, survivors aged and passed on. Each year fewer attended the memorial ceremonies, their memories slowly becoming history. Yet their words remained etched into stone, into the records, into the conscience of nations. The atomic age had begun with a single flash, but its echoes were eternal. For every scientist who sought to advance nuclear power, for every general who spoke of deterrence, there was a shadow, one of a burned city, a mother clutching her child, a sky turned white. Humanity had won the war, but it had also learned the true price of victory. The world could no longer claim innocence. And as the decades passed, that truth only deepened. Hiroshima was no longer just a city in Japan, it was a symbol that belonged to all mankind. The flames that swept Hiroshima did not merely consume wood and paper, they devoured the line between morality and necessity. Those who witnessed it from the air struggled to describe what they saw. Captain Robert Lewis, co-pilot of the Enola Gay, wrote later in his logbook, "My God, what have we done?" The question was not shouted in triumph but whispered in disbelief. From 31,000 feet, the mushroom cloud rose like a living thing, twisting, swelling, clawing its way into the heavens. Beneath it, the city vanished. On the ground, there was no such distance. Those within a mile of the blast were gone instantly, vaporized or buried beneath what had once been their homes. Farther out, survivors stumbled through a world stripped of color, the very air tasting of metal and ash. Many clutched burned skin that hung in ribbons. Others carried what they thought were children, only to realize, in the blinding dust, they were holding nothing but tattered clothes. It took 17 hours before President Truman addressed the world. His voice, firm and measured, came over the radio waves. "We have just dropped a bomb on Hiroshima, an important Japanese army base." The phrasing was deliberate, factual, restrained. The full horror was still unknown, even to him. Yet behind the words lay a message to friend and foe alike. America now held a weapon beyond imagination. Back in the Pacific, sailors aboard the USS Indianapolis, the very ship that had delivered the bomb's uranium core, never heard the announcement. Their vessel had been sunk days earlier by a Japanese submarine. Hundreds of men floated in the open ocean, clinging to debris, surrounded by sharks. By the time rescuers arrived, nearly 900 were dead. It was a cruel irony. The ship that carried the bomb destined to end the war met its own tragic fate before the world even knew of Hiroshima. But Japan did not surrender. Even as the ashes of Hiroshima cooled, military leaders debated in Tokyo. To them, one destroyed city, however terrible, did not mean total defeat. They believed the Americans had only a handful of such weapons. They gambled that Japan could endure long enough to force a negotiated peace. It was a miscalculation that would cost tens of thousands more lives. 3 days later, August 9, 1945, a date that would carve itself into history alongside Hiroshima. At 3:47 a.m., another B-29 bomber, Bockscar, lifted off from Tinian Island. Aboard was a second atomic bomb, this one using plutonium instead of uranium. Its name was Fat Man. The crew's original target was Kokura, but when they arrived, the city was covered by heavy cloud and smoke. Fuel was running low. The pilot, Major Charles Sweeney, turned toward the secondary target, Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., through a small break in the clouds, the bomb fell. It detonated 1,650 feet above the city's Urakami Valley. The explosion was even more powerful than Hiroshima's. The shockwave ripped across the valley, shattering homes, churches, and factories. In the blink of an eye, 40,000 lives were extinguished. Within weeks, the total death toll would surpass 70,000. Among the ruins stood the remains of the Urakami Cathedral, once the largest Catholic church in East Asia. Its stone walls, reduced to rubble, became a symbol of the indiscriminate reach of this new weapon. Those who crawled from the wreckage could not comprehend what had happened. One survivor later wrote, "It was as though the sun had fallen to earth." In Washington, the second bombing shocked even those who had approved it. Some questioned whether two had been necessary. Others argued that Japan's refusal to surrender after Hiroshima left no alternative. But by the time the smoke cleared over Nagasaki, the debate no longer mattered. The message was unmistakable. The age of atomic warfare had begun. That evening, Emperor Hirohito gathered his ministers in the imperial bunker. For hours they argued, some insisting Japan must fight on, others begging the emperor to end the suffering. Finally, in a voice few of his subjects had ever heard, Hirohito spoke, "I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer." The next day, Japan sent word through neutral channels they would accept the terms of surrender. August 15, 1945. Across the Pacific, Americans awoke to the sound of radio broadcasts announcing victory. "This is the end," one announcer said, his voice trembling. "The war is over." Across small towns and big cities, church bells rang. Strangers embraced in the streets. In New York's Times Square, a sailor kissed a nurse beneath a rain of confetti, an image that would become an icon of joy after years of bloodshed. But not everyone celebrated without reflection. Many who had fought in the Pacific, men who had seen Okinawa, Iwo Jima, Tarawa, stood silent as the news spread. They understood what it had taken to reach this day. They knew that victory had been bought not just with courage, but with the heaviest burden mankind had ever placed upon itself. In the weeks that followed, teams of American doctors and scientists entered Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What they found defied comprehension. Shadows burned into stone steps. Steel girders twisted like paper. Men and women who had survived the initial blast now dying from an invisible sickness that ravaged their blood and skin. The term radiation poisoning entered the language of war. Among those who visited Hiroshima was a Jesuit priest named Father Pedro Arup. He had survived the blast while living just outside the city center. He later wrote, "The sight that met my eyes was beyond belief. Every living thing was seared, trees, animals, human beings alike." His words carried not anger, but awe, or at the scale of destruction, or at humanity's power to both create and annihilate. In the United States, few civilians truly understood what had happened. Newspapers printed photos of a ruined city, but the details were sparse. For most Americans, the bomb was seen as the weapon that ended the war and saved countless lives that would have been lost in a land invasion. President Truman defended the decision, "We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans." To those who had fought their way across the Pacific, that argument carried weight. Many believed, and still believe, that the atomic bomb spared the world an even bloodier conclusion. Yet others, including several Manhattan Project scientists, began to question the path they had set humanity upon. They warned that the bomb was not merely a new weapon, it was the end of an era, the beginning of one in which mankind could destroy itself. That paradox, salvation through destruction, would haunt the world for decades to come. In the months after Japan's surrender, the magnitude of the atomic bomb's legacy became increasingly clear. Cities lay in ruin, survivors grappled with unseen wounds, and the world began to understand that the weapon used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had changed warfare forever. But beyond the immediate destruction, the bomb had sown a moral and psychological shift that no one could ignore. Humanity had glimpsed its own capacity for absolute annihilation, and from that point forward, the shadow of that single morning would shape every decision in global politics. Scientists who had created the bomb faced a reckoning of conscience. Many returned to civilian life with heavy hearts, aware that the knowledge they had unlocked could never be undone. Oppenheimer warned of a future dominated by fear and proliferation. He argued that the atomic bomb, though used to end a war, could lead to an era where the threat of global extinction became a constant reality. Other members of the Manhattan Project, however, focused on the promise of nuclear energy, a paradoxical pursuit. The same force that destroyed entire cities could also power nations. It was a duality that mirrored the human condition itself, the potential for creation and destruction, often intertwined. Across the Pacific, the Hibakusha, those who had survived the blasts, became the living conscience of the world. They bore wounds that were both visible and invisible, reminders of the instant horror and the lingering sickness caused by radiation. They were shunned in some communities, misunderstood, and often left to rebuild their lives from nothing. Yet, they persevered, establishing schools, hospitals, and memorials dedicated to peace. Their voices carried a simple but unyielding message: humanity must never repeat this mistake. Through lectures, essays, and public testimony, they sought to impress upon the world the full human cost of the atomic age. In Washington, the implications of the bomb were rapidly evolving. The United States, now a nuclear power, faced a new strategic reality. The Soviet Union, initially taken aback by the display of atomic force, accelerated its own weapons program, and by 1949, it had tested a bomb of its own. The race for supremacy had begun in earnest, and the logic of deterrence would dominate international relations for decades. The Cold War was born from the glow of Hiroshima's fireball, a conflict that relied not on open battle but on the unspoken threat of mutual destruction. American public opinion, meanwhile, remained conflicted. Many citizens accepted the bomb as a necessary instrument of war, a decisive action that saved countless American lives. Others wrestled with moral unease, especially as details emerged about the indiscriminate killing of civilians. Newspapers carried images of flattened neighborhoods and burned bodies, and yet for much of the nation, these horrors were abstract, distant, and difficult to reconcile with the relief that the war was over. The complexity of victory weighed heavily on a generation that had lived through global conflict. The Japanese government, facing the unimaginable, began a process of transformation under the supervision of the American occupation. Democracy was implemented, and a pacifist constitution enshrined the renunciation of war. Education reform sought to instill both knowledge and responsibility in the next generation. Rebuilding cities became not merely a practical task but a symbolic one, a commitment to rise from the ashes, to demonstrate that even after utter devastation, life could endure. Yet even amid this recovery, the memory of those August days in 1945 remained ever present. Every survivor, every family, every street carried the imprint of what had been lost. Internationally, the bomb reshaped diplomacy and military strategy. Nations sought alliances, built stockpiles, and considered the ethical dimensions of nuclear warfare. Scholars debated the morality of deterrence, generals planned for contingencies that could erase cities in minutes, and civilians lived with the knowledge that one misstep could repeat history's darkest hour. The world had entered the atomic age, a new era defined not by borders or armies, but by the invisible threat hanging over every human being. Over the ensuing decades, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became global symbols of both warning and hope. Memorials were erected, museums established, and annual ceremonies ensured that the dead would not be forgotten. Survivors told their stories repeatedly, often with tears, often with quiet dignity, reminding the world that human life carries value beyond political calculations. These voices became essential in framing the discussion about nuclear weapons, not as abstract tools of power, but as instruments whose consequences are measured in human suffering. In the United States, veterans who had flown over the cities, who had watched the fires rise from the air, spent their lives recounting experiences that were simultaneously extraordinary and horrifying. Some justified their actions, believing that they had ended the war and saved lives. Others spoke in quiet tones of guilt and doubt, wrestling with the knowledge that they had been the agents of destruction on a scale never before known. The tension between duty and conscience became a hallmark of the post-war generation. By the 1960s, as the Cold War escalated, the lessons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki took on renewed urgency. The Cuban Missile Crisis, in particular, demonstrated that even decades later, a single miscalculation could lead to global catastrophe. Leaders in Washington and Moscow studied history intently, aware that nuclear weapons demanded both respect and fear. Citizens practiced drills, built shelters, and lived in a society defined by a constant, invisible threat. The atomic bomb, once a tool of war, had become a framework for understanding human vulnerability and the fragility of civilization. In Japan, the reconstruction continued. Cities transformed into bustling metropolises, industries flourished, and the nation redefined itself on the global stage. Yet the scars of the atomic bomb remained etched into the cultural memory. Artists painted, writers chronicled, and filmmakers dramatized the events of those August mornings. These cultural expressions served as both memorials and warnings, emphasizing the human cost of technological progress when divorced from ethical restraint. Over time, the bomb's legacy reached into philosophy, politics, and science. Leaders, scholars, and citizens debated whether the horrors of Hiroshima could ever justify the strategic objectives that led to it. Some argued that the atomic bomb was the grim key that ended a global conflict, sparing more lives than it destroyed. Others contended that no calculation of convenience could ever erase the reality of tens of thousands of civilians incinerated in seconds. These debates would continue for generations, shaping not only policy but the very way humanity understood its own power. By the turn of the 21st century, the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki stood as reminders of the delicate balance between progress and destruction. Peace museums documented both the science of the bomb and the personal stories of survivors. Annual ceremonies drew participants from across the world. Every year, thousands of paper lanterns floated down the Motoyasu River, each light a testament to lives lost, to lessons learned, and to a hope that the human race might never again endure such suffering. And yet, even as decades passed, the atomic age remained a living presence in international affairs. Nations continued to develop weapons of mass destruction, and the moral questions first raised in August of 1945 persisted. Could technology be restrained? Could humanity govern the consequences of its own genius? These questions, first posed in the skies above Hiroshima, continue to echo today. For Americans who lived through the war, the atomic bomb was both a symbol of ingenuity and a source of deep reflection. Men who had stormed beaches, flown long missions, and endured unspeakable hardship understood that victory was never simple. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the end of war could bring both relief and sorrow. The bomb had ended a conflict, it had also illuminated the profound responsibility that comes with wielding such unprecedented power. And in Japan, survivors bore the memory of that day with quiet resilience. Their stories became the conscience of the world, a living reminder that human life, once extinguished by a single flash, demands vigilance, care, and moral reckoning. The bomb had changed warfare, geopolitics, and science. But it had also changed how humanity thinks about itself, about life, death, morality, and the consequences of choices made in desperation. The story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of 90,000 souls lost in one morning, is not merely a story of war. It is a story of humanity confronted with its own capacity for destruction, forced to reckon with the terrifying clarity of its own ingenuity. The images of smoke and ash, of shadows burned into walls, and of the few who survived against all odds, remain etched into memory. They remind us that victory is never simple, that power carries responsibility, and that the decisions of a few can ripple across the lives of millions. Even today, when planes fly silently overhead or when new generations learn of the events of August 1945, the lesson remains: technology without conscience can destroy civilization in moments, but humanity's capacity for reflection, rebuilding, and compassion offers the chance to prevent history from repeating itself. The atomic bomb did not merely end a war, it began an era of reflection, vigilance, and ethical reckoning. And it serves as a reminder that even in triumph, humanity is never absolved from the weight of its choices.